The man who once commanded $20 million per film, who built an empire on being Hollywood's most likable star, hasn't been able to sleep through a full night since March 27, 2022. The night he slapped Chris Rock and destroyed 40 years of carefully crafted perfection in 10 seconds. Will Smith, who taught us to laugh through Fresh Prince and cry through The Pursuit of Happyness, now admits he takes anxiety medication every 4 hours, sees a therapist daily, and still can't watch his own films without feeling like a fraud. Behind that million-dollar smile lies a man whose own children publicly disowned him, whose marriage became an internet meme about entanglement, and who spent decades performing happiness while contemplating ending everything. What you're about to discover will shatter the image of Hollywood's former golden boy, a man who had everything except the ability to stop pretending he was okay. If Will Smith's performances ever made you believe in hope, leave a like and subscribe below. There's a moment in Will Smith's childhood that explains everything. Watching his father, William Daddy-O Smith Sr., punch his mother Caroline so hard she spit blood across their Winfield kitchen floor while 9-year-old Will stood frozen, too terrified to defend her, too small to matter. Long before the world would know him as the Fresh Prince, he was Willard Carroll Smith Jr., learning that love meant violence, that fathers could be both provider and terrorist, and that making people laugh was the only way to defuse the bomb that was Daddy-O's rage. Will was born on September 25, 1968, in West Philadelphia, to Caroline, a school board employee, and Daddy-O, a refrigeration engineer who built a successful business with his fists and maintained his family the same way. The Smith household was middle-class success hiding domestic warfare. Daddy-O was disciplined, military strict, demanding perfection while demonstrating violence. He'd make Will and his siblings rebuild walls if the bricks weren't perfectly aligned, starting over at 2 a.m. if necessary. Excellence or nothing was the family motto, but excellence never prevented the explosions. Will learned to read his father's breathing patterns, the way his jaw clenched before eruption, the specific sound his footsteps made when violence was coming. "I became a scientist of my father's rage," Will would later tell his therapist. "I could predict his violence within a 3-second margin." The comedy that would make Will famous started as survival strategy. He discovered that making Daddy-O laugh could delay or prevent beatings. That being funny was literally life-saving. By age 10, Will had developed different comedic personas for different threat levels: silly for mild anger, self-deprecating for serious rage, completely submissive for when nothing else worked. His younger siblings would hide behind him, knowing Will would perform whatever emotional labor required to redirect their father's violence. "I wasn't the class clown," Will explained. "I was the family hostage negotiator." School became the laboratory where Will perfected his protective persona. Teachers loved him because he was charming, students loved him because he was funny. Everyone loved him because that was the point. Being loved meant being safe. He'd memorize rap songs, perform them at lunch, anything to be valuable enough that people wouldn't hurt him. But the performance was exhausting. "I was acting before I knew what acting was," Will reflected. "Every interaction was calculated to prevent violence I assumed was always coming." His mother Caroline's response to the abuse created its own trauma. She'd pretend nothing happened, clean blood from floors while humming gospel songs, tell her children that Daddy-O was a good provider who just got stressed. The gaslighting was almost worse than the violence. Being told that obvious terror was actually love, that fear was respect, that staying was strength. When Will tried talking about the abuse, she'd say, "Your father works hard for this family. We don't discuss private matters." The lesson embedded: performance was preferable to truth. Secrets were safer than honesty. When his parents finally divorced when Will was 13, the relief mixed with devastating guilt. Will had spent years fantasizing about killing his father to protect his mother, but when she was finally free, he felt responsible for not acting sooner. "I carried the shame of my cowardice," he admitted decades later. "Every success felt hollow because when it mattered most, when my mother was bleeding, I did nothing." The boy who learned to perform happiness to prevent violence would become the man who performed happiness professionally, but could never quite convince himself the performance was real. At 19, Will Smith stood outside a Philadelphia IRS office in 1988, having just learned he owed $2.8 million in taxes. From music earnings he'd already spent, his rap career with DJ Jazzy Jeff seemingly over before it really began. They'd won the first Grammy for rap in 1989, but Will had blown the money on cars, jewelry, and a mansion he couldn't afford, thinking success was permanent. The IRS seized his cars, froze his accounts, and garnished future earnings. He was sleeping on DJ Jazzy Jeff's couch, too proud to return to Daddy-O, too broke to maintain the image everyone expected. "I went from Grammy winner to government property in 6 months," Will would later reflect. "Success had been another performance I couldn't sustain." Those first years after the tax disaster were exercises in rebuilding from negative worth. Will took any gig that paid cash the IRS couldn't track, performing at bar mitzvahs, sweet 16s, venues where former Grammy winners became cautionary tales. He'd watch Eddie Murphy and Denzel Washington movies obsessively, studying how they crossed from music to film, convinced acting was his escape route from financial ruin. But auditions required headshots he couldn't afford, acting classes he couldn't pay for, and confidence that bankruptcy had destroyed. The breakthrough came through desperation, meeting opportunity. Quincy Jones and Benny Medina were developing a show about a street-smart kid in Bel-Air, basically Will's life in reverse. The audition was legendary. Will had 15 minutes, no script, just told to be himself. He performed every persona he'd developed surviving Daddy-O, the charmer, the comedian, the vulnerable kid beneath bravado. "I wasn't auditioning," Will explained. "I was surviving. NBC was just another authority figure I needed to make love me, but the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air came with a devil's bargain. NBC would pay him $750,000 per season, but the IRS would take 70% for 3 years. Will was essentially working for the government, performing Happyness while broke, maintaining the image of success while eating ramen in his trailer. The show's success made him famous, but not wealthy, loved, but still financially enslaved. "I was America's favorite teenager at 22, he reflected, lying about my age and my life simultaneously. The real shift came through relentless work that bordered on mania. Will would film Fresh Prince all day, study acting all night, write rap on weekends. He hired acting coaches with money he didn't have, promising payment from future success. He analyzed every successful black actor's career, creating mathematical formulas for stardom. Comedy plus action plus family appeal equals bankability. The calculation was sociopathic in precision, but necessary for someone who'd learned survival required strategy. Between 1990 and 1993, Will transformed from rapper turned actor to legitimate star, but the cost was invisible. He was taking stimulants to maintain the schedule, drinking to sleep, performing even when cameras weren't rolling. The IRS debt was cleared, but the psychological debt accumulated. Every success felt temporary. Every achievement seemed borrowed. "I succeeded through fear," Will admitted. Fear of returning to that IRS office. Fear of proving Daddy-O right about me being worthless. Fear that if I stopped moving, everyone would see I was actually nobody. The resurrection from financial ruin to television star should have been triumph. But for Will, it was just another performance where the stakes were survival. The role of Muhammad Ali in Michael Mann's Ali wasn't supposed to transform Will Smith from television star to serious actor. He was the second choice after Denzel Washington passed, and boxing consultants said Will's body type was wrong, his movement too loose, his understanding of Ali superficial. Will was 32, had just come off Wild Wild West's catastrophic failure, and needed to prove he was more than the Fresh Prince with a movie budget. He had 1 year to transform his body and mind into the most scrutinized athlete of the 20th century. Will gained 35 pounds of muscle, trained 6 hours daily, studied Islam despite being raised Baptist, and learned to speak in Ali's rhythm until he lost his own voice. "I wasn't playing Ali," Will later explained. "I was erasing Will Smith to make room for Muhammad." Behind the scenes, Will's preparation bordered on identity dissolution. He lived as Ali for a year before filming, speaking in Ali's cadence, adopting his dietary restrictions, even developing Ali's relationships with women that stressed his marriage to Jada. Michael Mann later revealed Will would call him at 3 a.m. in character, discussing Vietnam as if it were current, referring to himself as the greatest, without irony. The physical transformation required twice daily boxing sessions that left Will vomiting from exhaustion, ice baths that triggered panic attacks, and sparring sessions where professional boxers were told not to hold back. The psychological preparation was even more extreme. Will studied Ali's relationship with his father, finding parallels to Daddio that were devastating. Both had fathers who were present but damaging, who taught their sons to fight but not to feel. During filming of Ali's exile years, Will genuinely experienced depression so severe that production considered intervention. "I understood Ali's loneliness," Will reflected. "Being punished for principled stands, losing everything for refusing to perform what others expected." When Ali released in December 2001, Will's performance transcended impersonation. Critics who dismissed him as lightweight suddenly recognized depth they'd never suspected. Roger Ebert wrote that Will inhabits Ali's soul, while Ali himself said watching Will was like looking in a mirror from the past. The performance earned Will his first Oscar nomination for Best Actor, validation that he was more than charm and calculation. Standing at the Academy Awards, Will felt not triumph, but terror. Now people expected range he wasn't sure he could replicate. But even at this pinnacle moment, darkness crept in. The Oscar nomination triggered Daddio's criticism rather than pride. "You didn't win, though, did you?" The transformation into Ali had strained his marriage to Jada, who complained Will had been absent even when present, method acting as abandonment. The physical transformation had required substances, legal but dangerous, that Will continued using after filming, addicted to the control over his body. "Success felt like another trap," Will admitted. "Now I had to be excellent at everything, not just comedy." The role that should have liberated Will from typecasting instead imprisoned him in perfectionism. He'd proven he could transform completely, but at what cost? The man who'd played the greatest athlete of all time was secretly medicating anxiety with Xanax, managing depression with therapy Jada didn't know about, and performing Happyness while contemplating whether success was worth the exhaustion of constant excellence. Ali had fought for principles. Will was just fighting to maintain an image that felt increasingly false. By 2008, Will Smith wasn't just a movie star. He was Hollywood's most bankable actor, commanding $20 million plus 20% of gross, having delivered 8 consecutive films that opened at number 1, a record that transformed him from actor to algorithm. His production company, Overbrook Entertainment, controlled his projects with scientific precision. He owned properties worth $100 million, including a $20 million Calabasas compound with its own lake. With Jada, Jaden, and Willow, he'd built Hollywood's most visible family brand, every appearance calculated for maximum impact. The man who'd owed the IRS millions now generated billions for studios. But even at this impossible peak, Will was medicating perfection with a cocktail of prescribed anxiety medication, therapy sessions he hid from everyone, and a marriage that was performance art for public consumption. The public saw an unbroken string of triumphs. I Am Legend, earning $585 million. Hancock, proving he could carry any concept. 7 pounds showing range despite mixed reviews. But privately, Will was crumbling under self-imposed pressure. He had a team of analysts studying box office patterns, demographic data, and release strategies like stock traders. Every script was evaluated through his formula. 10 tears, plus 20 laughs, plus 1 death equals Oscar consideration. I wasn't choosing roles, Will later admitted. I was computing probabilities of success. The relationship with Jada had evolved into business partnership disguised as marriage. They maintained separate bedrooms in their compound, scheduled intimacy-like meetings, and attended couples therapy that was more negotiation than healing. Their children, Jaden and Willow, were being groomed as extensions of the Smith brand, their childhood sacrificed for family legacy. We weren't a family, Willow would later reveal. We were a corporation with shared DNA. Working with directors like Peter Berg, Gabriele Muccino, and M. Night Shyamalan, Will became known as the most controlling actor in Hollywood, rewriting scripts, suggesting camera angles, essentially co-directing through manipulation disguised as collaboration. He'd arrive with binders of notes, statistical analysis of what audiences wanted, mathematical proofs for why scenes should change. Directors either surrendered or were replaced. Will didn't act in movies, one director revealed anonymously. He engineered them. Success is the most elaborate prison, Will told his therapist during this period. Every achievement raises the bar for the next. You can't fail, because failure isn't just personal, it's brand destruction. By 2009, at the absolute peak of his powers, Will Smith had everything measurable: wealth, fame, family, and statistical proof of his dominance. But he also had chronic insomnia requiring Ambien, panic attacks managed by Xanax, and a marriage that existed primarily in public appearances. The tipping point was invisible, but inevitable. During 7 Pounds promotion, Will had a breakdown in his trailer, sobbing uncontrollably for reasons he couldn't articulate. The weight of performing perfection had become unbearable. He'd achieved everything Dadio said he couldn't, proved every doubter wrong, but felt emptier with each success. I had everything except the ability to feel it, Will reflected. Success had become another violence, not physical like my father's, but psychological, and I was both perpetrator and victim. The man who'd mastered the formula for Hollywood dominance was about to discover that some slaps echo forever, and the one that would destroy everything hadn't even happened yet. Will's marriage to Sherry Zampino in 1992 began with the desperate hope of creating the stable family he'd never had. She was grounded, religious, unimpressed by fame, everything Will thought would anchor him to reality. They married after dating just 3 months, Will proposing during a panic about turning 24 without a family, terrified of becoming daddy-o. Their son Trey was born in 1992, and for exactly 1 year, Will performed perfect fatherhood with the same intensity he performed everything else. I thought marriage was another role to master, Will later admitted. I studied husbands like scripts, mimicked what looked successful, never understanding that authenticity was the only thing that mattered. The divorce in 1995 came when Cherie discovered Will had been emotionally involved with Jada Pinkett, whom he'd met at a Fresh Prince audition. Cherie found love letters, emotional affairs disguised as friendship, Will constructing his next relationship while still performing the current one. Will needs an audience even in marriage, Cherie would later say. When you stop applauding, he finds someone who will. The divorce cost millions, but the emotional cost was worse. Trey, at 3, became another child of divorce, repeating Will's pattern despite his desperate attempts to break it. Then came Jada Pinkett in 1997, a marriage that would become Hollywood's most analyzed relationship. They married on New Year's Eve at her Baltimore estate while she was 3 months pregnant with Jaden, the ceremony feeling more like merger than marriage. Jada wasn't impressed by Will's fame. She had her own career, her own ambitions, and most importantly, her own damage from childhood that made her recognize Will's performances. "We were two broken people who thought we could build something whole," Jada reflected on Red Table Talk. But broken plus broken just equals more broken. The marriage's evolution into life partnership, rather than traditional union, began almost immediately. By 2008, they were living separate lives within the same compound, maintaining the image for their brand, while privately exploring what Jada would later call entanglements. Will knew about Jada's relationship with August Alsina, but agreed to open marriage rather than public divorce. The arrangement was sophisticated dysfunction. They'd attend premieres holding hands, then return to separate wings of their house. "We weren't married," Will admitted. "We were business partners with children and history." The impact on Jaden and Willow was profound and public. Both children were forced into careers as family brand extensions, their childhood sacrificed for Smith legacy. Jaden's emancipation attempt at 15, Willow's self-harm revelation, both children publicly distancing themselves from parents who'd made them props in performed perfection. "We were accessories to our parents' ambitions," Willow said in an interview that devastated Will. "They loved us, but they loved the idea of the Smith family more. Love for me was always performance," Will finally understood in therapy. "I performed being a good husband, good father, good person, but I never actually was any of those things. I was just acting, and everyone knew except me." The relationship with Jada became increasingly toxic and public. The August Alsina revelation, the Red Table Talk admissions, the obvious pain disguised as evolved thinking. By 2020, they weren't married in any meaningful way, just two people held together by shared assets, public image, and the inability to admit failure. The man who'd built a career on charm and likability couldn't charm his way into authentic love, couldn't calculate the formula for genuine connection. In November 2021, while filming Emancipation, Will Smith collapsed on set in Louisiana from what was initially diagnosed as heat exhaustion, but was actually a severe panic disorder that had been building for decades, manifesting as chest pain so intense he thought he was having a heart attack. The immediate medical examination revealed Will had been functioning with dangerously high cortisol levels for years, his blood pressure at stroke risk readings despite peak physical fitness, and brain scans showing hyperactivity in regions associated with chronic anxiety. "My body was screaming what my mouth couldn't say," Will later told his therapist, "that I was dying from the inside out while smiling for cameras." The exact medical crisis was more complex than simple anxiety. Years of prescription medication for depression and anxiety had created dependency Will didn't acknowledge. He was taking Xanax for panic attacks, Ambien for sleep, Adderall for focus during 18-hour days, and beta blockers for public appearances. The cocktail kept him functional, but destroyed his natural chemistry. His testosterone had crashed from stress, requiring hormone replacement. His adrenal glands were failing from decades of fight-or-flight mode. "I was a pharmaceutical miracle," Will admitted, standing upright through chemistry while falling apart organically. The psychological evaluation revealed devastating truths. Will had been experiencing dissociation for years, feeling disconnected from his body during interviews, watching himself perform from outside himself. He'd have episodes where he couldn't remember entire days of filming, his brain protecting him from stress by erasing experience. The therapist diagnosed complex PTSD from childhood trauma he'd never addressed, just performed around. Every success was me running from that kitchen where my mother bled. Will finally understood. But you can't outrun memories. They just wait for you to exhaust yourself. The treatment required complete restructuring of Will's existence. He had to stop working for the first time since age 16, entering intensive therapy that included EMDR for trauma, cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety, and group therapy where he wasn't special. The withdrawal from prescription medications was managed medically, but brutal. Tremors, insomnia worse than before, and panic attacks that felt like death. Getting clean from legal drugs was harder than if I'd been on street substances, Will explained, because everyone enabled it, insurance covered it, and doctors prescribed it. Recovery became about unlearning performance as survival. Will had to practice being present without achieving, existing without producing, feeling without numbing. The therapy revealed that his entire identity was built on external validation, from Daddy-O, from audiences, from box office numbers. Without those metrics, he didn't know who he was. I discovered I didn't exist, Will said. There was Will Smith the brand, Will Smith the performance, but Will Smith the person had never been developed. The slap hadn't happened yet, Will reflected on this period, but my body knew something was coming. The breakdown was prophecy. The man who'd perfected control was losing it systematically. His marriage was public dysfunction. His children were distancing themselves. His body was failing from decades of suppressed trauma. He returned to work for the 2022 Oscar campaign, medicated differently but not healed, performing recovery rather than experiencing it. The acceptance speech he'd planned for winning Best Actor included thanks to therapists, acknowledgement of medication, and admission of imperfection. Instead, the slap would make all those words irrelevant, turning private crisis into public catastrophe. The call came at 5:30 a.m. on November 7, 2016, while Will was filming Bright in Los Angeles, his sister Ellen calling with words that shattered his carefully constructed world. Their father, Daddy-O, had died from cancer at age 76, alone in a Philadelphia hospital, while Will was performing for cameras 3,000 miles away. The man who'd terrorized Will's childhood, whose violence shaped every success, whose approval Will had spent 40 years seeking through achievement, died without reconciliation, without the conversation Will had scripted in therapy but never delivered. He died while I was pretending to be someone else, Will later reflected. The perfect metaphor for our entire relationship, me performing while he remained unmoved. The history between father and son was Hollywood's hidden tragedy. Daddy-O had never acknowledged Will's success as validation, viewing the wealth and fame as soft compared to the refrigeration business he'd built with his hands. He'd attend Will's premieres but leave early, criticizing rather than celebrating. When Will won his first Grammy, Daddy-O asked why he hadn't won too. When Will got his first Oscar nomination, Daddy-O pointed out he hadn't won. Nothing was ever enough, Will told his therapist. I gave him grandchildren, millions, fame by association, and he still looked at me like the 9-year-old who didn't protect his mother. The last years of Daddy-O's life were cruel reversal. The cancer that destroyed his body forced vulnerability he'd never allowed. Will would visit, paying for treatments Daddy-O was too proud to accept gracefully, sitting beside a man who'd become small and fragile, but still couldn't say, "I love you." During one visit, Daddy-O grabbed Will's hand with surprising strength and said, "I did the best I could," the closest he'd come to apology. Will wanted to scream about the violence, the terror, the childhood lost to fear, but instead said, "I know, Dad," performing forgiveness he didn't feel. What Will never told anyone was that he'd been planning Daddy-O's murder since age 9. Not actively, but as a recurring fantasy where he'd protect his mother, where he'd be brave enough to stop the violence. Even as an adult, successful beyond imagination, Will would dream about killing his father, wake feeling guilty for thoughts that felt like betrayal and relief simultaneously. "I carried the weight of wanting my father dead," Will admitted in his memoir. "When he actually died, I felt nothing, which was worse than grief." The funeral in Philadelphia was surreal, Will delivering a eulogy about a man he'd feared more than loved, calling him dedicated instead of abusive, disciplined instead of violent. The extended family praised Daddy-O as a provider, a businessman, a patriarch, while Will's siblings sat silent, knowing the truth. Jada held Will's hand, feeling him tremble with rage rather than grief. "I performed one last time for him," Will said. "Even dead, I couldn't stop trying to make him proud." The aftermath revealed how much of Will's life had been shaped by Daddy-O's ghost. Every achievement was an argument with a dead man, every success a rebuke to someone no longer listening. Without Daddy-O to prove wrong or make proud, Will's motivation evaporated. The anger that had fueled his rise had nowhere to go except inward. "I realized I'd never been working for myself," Will told his therapist. "Every movie, every award, every dollar was me trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it. When he died, my purpose died too." The loss wasn't just of a father, but of the enemy that had defined him, the violence that had shaped him, the first audience he'd ever performed for. By March 27, 2022, Will Smith sat atop a fortune worth $350 million, was about to win his first Oscar for King Richard, and had completed a triumphant comeback from years of box office failures. But in 10 seconds on live television, when his hand connected with Chris Rock's face, Will destroyed 40 years of carefully built equity in a moment that would cost him an estimated $200 million in lost projects and transform him from Hollywood's most bankable star to its most toxic asset. "I went from inevitable winner to instant pariah in the time it takes to walk across a stage," Will reflected months later. 40 years of perfection, undone by 10 seconds of truth. The immediate financial catastrophe was staggering. Netflix halted Fast and Loose, with a $40 million payday evaporating. Sony delayed Bad Boys 4 indefinitely, costing another $25 million. Apple TV Plus reconsidered their $150 million deal for Emancipation, eventually releasing it to minimal promotion. Every studio that had projects in development with Overbrook Entertainment either canceled or indefinitely postponed them. Will went from guaranteed profit to guaranteed controversy, an executive revealed. Insurance companies won't even quote coverage now. Behind the scenes, the resignation from the Academy was damage control that damaged more. Will's team calculated that resigning before being expelled would allow faster rehabilitation, but it backfired. He looked guilty rather than accountable. The 10-year ban from Academy events meant a decade of reduced visibility during Hollywood's most important season. His production company lost key employees who didn't want association with the slap. Streaming services that had been bidding for his memoir adaptation pulled out entirely. Success became evidence of failure, Will observed. Every achievement now had an asterisk. Before the slap. The attempted comeback through Emancipation revealed how thoroughly he'd been rejected. The film Apple had positioned for Oscars became a burial, minimal marketing, quiet release, audiences refusing to separate art from artist. The apology tour felt calculated rather than genuine, every interview dissected for performance rather than truth. Social media turned him into a meme, the slap overshadowing every role he'd ever played. "I became my worst moment," Will admitted. "Not the guy who played Allie or pursued happiness, just the guy who slapped Chris Rock." The slow reckoning came through therapy that revealed the slap wasn't spontaneous, but inevitable. 40 years of suppressed rage finally erupting at the worst possible moment. Will had been protecting people who didn't need protection, fighting battles that weren't his, repeating Daddy-O's violence with Hollywood validation. The slap was my father's hand using my arm, Will understood. Every suppressed moment of rage from childhood came out defending a woman who wasn't even upset. By 2024, Will Smith had partially returned through carefully managed appearances, but the financial empire had crumbled. Projects paid half previous quotes with morality clauses that could terminate for any controversy. The man who'd calculated every career move with scientific precision had discovered that some mistakes can't be computed away. Some slaps echo forever, and sometimes the greatest performance is pretending recovery when you're really just managing decline. By 2024, Will Smith's appearance at public events had become carefully choreographed damage control, where handlers guided him through predetermined talking points, his responses so rehearsed they felt like AI programming rather than human conversation. What the public didn't know was that Will had been experiencing severe depression, requiring daily therapy, medication adjustments every few weeks, and suicide ideation that led to a brief psychiatric hold in 2023 that his team successfully hid from media. At 56, the man who'd perfected performing Happyness couldn't maintain the act anymore, breaking down during interviews, forgetting his rehearsed responses, sometimes sitting in silence when asked about his legacy. The psychological deterioration manifested in increasingly visible ways. During a recent podcast appearance, Will began crying uncontrollably when asked about his children, unable to stop for nearly 10 minutes while the host sat uncomfortably. He'd forget which project he was promoting, sometimes discussing films from decades ago as if they were current. The famous charm had been replaced by desperate attempts at connection that felt hollow. "We're watching someone disappear while trying to reappear," a former colleague observed. "He's performing Will Smith, but doesn't remember who that was." Public response had calcified into permanent rejection. Every appearance triggered fresh waves of slap memes, rock defenders, and detailed analysis of his narcissism. His children had distanced themselves publicly. Jaden rarely acknowledged him. Willow spoke about healing from childhood trauma without naming him directly, and Trey maintained careful neutrality that felt like abandonment. When Will appeared at a premiere, photographers focused on who avoided him rather than who approached. "I've become Hollywood's ghost," Will told his therapist. "Present, but untouchable." The isolation had become complete, despite constant monitoring. Jada had essentially separated, though they maintained public appearances, living in different properties while pretending unity. His team managed every interaction, scripted every word, controlled every image, but couldn't control the collapse happening internally. Will couldn't be alone, not from suicide risk, but from the terror of silence where thoughts lived. He'd hired people just to exist in his space, background noise to avoid confronting himself. Recent attempts at rehabilitation felt like performance art. The documentary about his life became autopsy of his death, examining what went wrong rather than celebrating what went right. His autobiography's audiobook included crying that wasn't acting, breakdowns that weren't scripted, an appearance where he seemed confused about whether he'd won the Oscar before or after the slap went viral as evidence of psychological break. "I've become what I always feared," Will admitted during a moment of clarity. "My father's violence in public, my mother's denial in private, and my children's absence as verdict." The work continued through desperation rather than desire. Voice work for animated films where his face didn't appear, producer credits on projects he didn't participate in, anything maintaining the illusion of relevance. But audiences had moved on. Hollywood had replaced him, and the culture that once celebrated him now studied him as cautionary tale. At 56, Will Smith existed in permanent purgatory. Too famous to disappear, too damaged to return, performing recovery for audiences who'd already changed the channel. The man who'd calculated every move perfectly had discovered some equations have no solution. Some slaps can't be taken back. And sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't falling, but having everyone watch you try to get up. Today, at 57, Will Smith continues performing rehabilitation while taking medication for depression that makes him feel disconnected, attending therapy that reveals more damage than healing, and maintaining a marriage that exists primarily in legal documents. He rises each morning in his Calabasas compound, a monument to success that feels like a mausoleum, takes pills for conditions caused by suppressing trauma for 50 years, and prepares for another day of being reminded that one moment can erase 4 decades. His net worth remains around $350 million, but his cultural worth has evaporated. The Oscar he finally won sits in storage, its meaning forever altered by what preceded it. He works now through intermediaries, ghost-producing projects, lending his name to things he barely participates in. The truth in Will's story. Sometimes the slap that destroys you isn't the one you receive, but the one you give. And sometimes perfection is just trauma wearing designer clothes. If this moved you, leave a like and subscribe for more stories of those who remind us that even the Fresh Prince can't stay fresh forever.